Well, hello everyone. Today, I'd like to introduce Kaustubh Deshpande. He is the co-founder of Eywa Neuro, where he's working on developing polyimide neural probes, among various other capabilities. He has previous experience working with NeuroNexus and Neuralink, and he graduated with an MS from Carnegie Mellon University in electrical and computer engineering. Can you tell us your story? I'd love to hear a bit more about your background and what brought you to where you are today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Bob. So I started off as an electrical engineer, and then my core focus was on a technology called MEMS, which is micro electromechanical systems. Kind of borrows from the IC manufacturing industry, but it leverages some of those principles to make very tiny mechanical structures along with electrical structures. So it's not just wiring, and it's not just routing of cable wires, but it's also developing mechanical structures on a silicon wafer. So when I was at Carnegie Mellon pursuing my master's, I started researching with Professor Chamanzar on parylene devices. And parylene is a very flexible material, and it's often used to passivate electrical structures. So there was this concept of using parylene as not just an insulator, but also a substrate on which we could pattern metal traces and pattern electrodes. These devices were used for recording from non-human primates. And the whole idea was to build a chronic device that could be easy to implant and could help in recording single units from the depth of the brain. At that work, I was able to publish a couple of papers and posters along with the other colleagues of mine at university, and that allowed me to get a job at NeuroNexus Technologies. So NeuroNexus at that point was probably the premier company that sold neural interfaces in general. And they used to use MEMS as a technology to do so. So they're based out of Michigan, and they were the first to pioneer the what's called the Michigan electrode, which is basically a lot of tiny electrodes on one silicon shank. So just to give you a little background in history, a lot of academics and neuroscientists used to use microwires when they did these experiments. And the game really changed when people started leveraging MEMS to create devices that would have the same cross-sectional footprint, but it would have a lot of channels incorporated on those. Because of the density of these electrodes, you could record and spatially isolate a lot of uh, single unit spikes and help in mapping the brain essentially. So in the 90s, this technology took off, and a lot of academics across the world started to utilize these probes for their research. And it's still today, the status quo of research, right, in electrophysiology and what's used. So I worked there and I started honing my skills on developing silicon-based neural interfaces as well as polyimide-based neural interfaces. Now, polyimide being a flexible material, much like parylene, is a little easier to microfabricate than parylene is, and it's also extremely inert. So it's currently one of perhaps the choice of material for a lot of neural interface designers. And at that point, NeuroNexus was working on developing DBS arrays. We used to call them DBMAs, which are deep brain multi-electrode arrays, and they had a lot of tiny electrodes to the order of 128 or 256 channels that were placed on a steel shank that basically kind of wrapped around the lead. And that was a new technology because it was an exact translation of what was currently being used, but adding more electrodes through the use of MEMS technology. And it was at that point that I really got into polyimide research in general because when you try to commercialize a technology, it's not just monolithic technical skills, but you've got challenges with sourcing materials, compliance, regulations, ensuring that the device is absolutely safe for use. My boss at NeuroNexus often used to say that, Kenny, we're only going to launch this device if you think it's safe to be put into your parents' brains or your brain. And that kind of stuck with me because I realized the real challenge with these devices, right? It's not something you prototype in the lab and hand it over to the physicians. It's something that has to be absolutely safe. So that thought took me, down this path where I started working on polyimide as a neural substrate. and also try to understand how I can synthesize a polyimide that's clinical grade. So not something that you buy off the shelf, but something that's specifically tailored for neural interface needs. So from NeuroNexus, my work got recognized. I was able to get a job at Neuralink. This was one of the earlier teams at Neuralink before, they expanded into Texas and grew larger. Over there, I worked on polyimide interfaces again, but at that point, the challenge was to make them very thin. So they were thinner than 5 microns. And the idea was to make them so thin that they do not cause any vasculature damage or any surgical damage when implanted. So just to give you an idea, they were so thin that you could put them between blood vessels in the brain. And it's hard to see blood vessels with the naked eye. You can only imagine how tiny these interfaces were. While at Neuralink, I again faced similar challenges with supply of polyamide. How do you scale it? How do you make it medical grade? Post COVID, personal and family reasons required me to move back. And before I did, I kind of realized that I've got this knowledge on polyimide, and that's a niche that not a lot of people had in the industry. So why not turn that into a competitive advantage and start something out of India? And so I came back, and over a couple of months, I started working on a recipe for a clinical grade polyimide. And I also developed perhaps India's first neural interface technology using MEMS that I could sell at reasonable rates, and I could really push forth as a consumable as opposed to something that's expensive and that had to be budgeted in to purchase. From there, I started Eywa Neuro in 2021, and it took me 2 years to now start supplying to a lot of companies across the world and send my product into various countries in the, like Israel, New Zealand, the United States, UK. My product is now, you know, medical. I'm on the verge of developing something that has the potential to be clinical and medical grade. We've taken our product through ISO certifications and testing, but the jury is still out. It's still a couple of more years before we're at that stage where we could push this as a new potential medical thin films medical treatment in humans. But at this point, the animal space, the life science space is pretty large, and I really hope that my product can allow scientists as well as physicians to appreciate the how tiny we can make them, and also gain more spatial information from their brain recordings, and basically enhance research more. So that's my story, and that's what I see myself doing for the next couple of years.
Sounds like it's been a very exciting journey so far, and definitely lots of interesting things for us to talk about ahead. Before we dive any further into like the technical details, I was wondering what sparked your initial interest in neuroscience or neurotechnology?
To be honest, I read an article. This is before, I even started my master's, but I read an article on biohacking. It talked about evolution in general, that how man progressed from a primate to where we are today as Homo sapiens. And it really questioned what's next in evolution. Would it be a biological evolution, or will it be a silicon evolution? And the whole idea of merging man with electronics was interesting, because at the very if I take a zoomed out version of what electronics are today, they're nothing but wires, right, that transmit information in the form of electrical signals. The same analogy works for humans as well. Our brain is what pushes these electrical signals, and the rest of our body just reacts to them. If I take my hand, right, it's a passive organ. It doesn't have any intelligence of its own. But when it gets these electrical signals from the brain, it knows exactly what to do. If I have to move my hand up and down, if I have to rotate my hand, and that's interesting, right? Because imagine if you could tap into those electrical signals, translate them to something a computer can understand. You could essentially add any modality to your to the functioning of a human being. There's instances where people have put pressure sensors in their feet so that they could feel earthquakes, more than other humans would. There are people who've done, who've tried to do some biohacking with IoT. It just seemed fascinating. So when I was at Carnegie Mellon, there was a new professor, right, who came in from Berkeley, and it was his research to kind of develop something that could allow the transduction of these electrical signals from the human body into usable signals for a computer, and it fascinated me. It was so futuristic, and it kind of reminded me of the Terminator days, right, where you could really, in the true sense of the word, become an android. And it you don't want to pass on an opportunity like that. So I got into that, and the more I learned about it, the more I realized the complexity of the problem, and it just kept going. And it's one of those things where once you're involved in something and you start gaining expertise in it, you kind of want to push more and more and more and carve a niche, right? And eventually, as I progressed through the field, I realized that I had a competitive advantage because of my study on flexible neural interfaces, MEMS, and Polyimide. That this is what I can do, and this is how I can add value to the chain. But at the end of the day, I think it's all in the interest of improving human lives, and it's also the social aspect of it, along with the technical challenge, right, that this problem processes. It just makes it such an interesting problem, to work on. So yeah, every morning you wake up and you realize, okay, I need to do this differently so that I can tap into better signals. And I remember the first time I witnessed an animal surgery where our devices were put into an animal and it could record electrical signals. It amazed me because I thought, let's go 100 years back, right? And think, can I record signals from a single neuron firing in the brain? And they would have had, no opportunity to do that. It's physically impossible to do that for them. And today we can record from a single neuron in the brain. When you see that little spike on your computer, it makes it all worth it. So that's how I got into it, and that's how I just became passionate about PCIs and this technology in general.
Well, I'm glad that you found the field, and I think the neurotech space is lucky to have you. A lot of those things that you mentioned are really exciting, like how if you look back 100 years ago, it would just blow anybody's mind to see what we're working on these days. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Yuqing, and she'll go through some of the more technical questions that we've prepared for you today.
All right, first thing on the line, I wanted to ask, because you mentioned going from kind of like a MEMS background into materials and focusing on the clinical translation part, if I understand that correctly. That's sometimes like a headache for engineers. It's something they have to learn on the fly and have to deal with when they take a device to market. I was just curious if you have any wisdom that you would share from all these years of working specifically to design a material to satisfy some of these regulations.
That's a good question. That's something I learned, while I was working in this field. It's a very good question, actually, and I wish if I could go back, if I knew the answer to it, then it would have changed the trajectory of my career for sure. But as an engineer, you're always kind of drawn to the technical aspect of your project. So when you look at the project, the first thing you do is try to evaluate, how challenging this is and how you would tackle it. And often, when you have a problem, you tend to pick up solutions that you already know of and then start applying them to the problem. But in my journey, right, through developing neural interfaces, I realized that the problem has to be addressed the other way around. So oftentimes, it's kind of, if I have to give an analogy, it's that phrase, right, where it isn't one solution that fits everything. When you go through it, you realize that a lot of the technology that is currently in use, like pacemakers or TPS electrodes or spinal stimulation electrodes, they're very similar. They're not much different. In fact, the IPG, right, pulse generator that's used with these solutions, they're very similar, and there's not much difference between them. So what happened in history is you kind of took the same solution and started applying it to different problems. When I started focusing on this, I realized that you have to address it the other way around. You need to first understand what the biological challenges are, And then you have to go back to the drawing board to create an interface that could address those challenges, all the while making sure that do not violate any compliance or regulatory protocols. For instance, getting an ISO certification, right, for your quality assurance and quality management, and even your products, it is so critical because as a medical device company, you cannot purchase from a vendor that's not ISO certified. That's a big problem, right? Because when you make a prototype in the lab, you're not necessarily looking at their ISO certification. Similarly, when you have the SOPs lined up in the lab, they have to have very concrete and rigid boundaries. You cannot deviate from them. And all of this, right, processes, the quality assurance has to be documented. And that's a big learning curve there. So, one thing that I could tell myself if I was younger is start learning these and start appreciating that the biology has to be addressed first before putting a technology to direct use. Understand the biological aspects, understand the regulatory and the compliance aspects, and using those create a neural interface, not the other way around where you max out on the best technology you have and then push it to clinical use.
Yeah, thank you for explaining all that. And anyways, like you sharing this now might save someone a lot of trouble in their career as well. Now, I want to go a little bit deeper into the technology that you mentioned, just focusing on the polyimide material. I saw that you guys put out a paper last September regarding the material you developed and how you tested it, because it is a novel material. So I would love to hear if you can explain briefly some of the trade-offs in terms of when you designed it. What are the things you might consider? For example, like you said, make it thin, but making a material coating thin comes with its own host of problems. So if you can walk us through.
Certainly. So if you go through literature for the last 30 years, we've talked about MEMS being this new technology, right, that could change the way neural interfaces are currently made. But you can't find any MEMS-based interfaces out there at all right now. And that's because the translation, right, from the chemical neural interface to a more human-sized interface never happened because of supplier constraints and also because of compliance constraints. In 1998, I believe Polyimide was introduced to the world for the first time as a potential material for neural interfaces. Polyimide is a very inert material, and if I'm not wrong, it was invented or at least put to use by NASA in some of their space programs. So it's a material that can survive temperatures up to 400 C and even survive negative temperatures down to, I believe, like 100 C or 120 C. So this material, because of its inertness, was quite lucrative for use as a neural substrate. On the electrical front, it's also an excellent insulator, and there's very limited crosstalk that happens when you pattern traces in it. Even today, I think polyimide still makes for one of the best flexible substrates that's out there compared to Parylene, SU8, liquid crystal polymers. So the focus was always on polyimide. That okay, how do you translate this thin film neural interface to clinical use? The first question that stumped a lot of people, right, and especially the early inventors, was how do you get a polyamide material, right, the precursor, which is clinically certified, or which is from an ISO certified company, and even the companies traditionally manufacturing these did not grant permission for the use of their polyamide in humans because they're not doing it in a clean room, or they're not doing it in a setting which would be safe or contaminant free for patients. So that was problem. That's the problem zero, right? You had to start from that level. MEMS people people had created different designs, and they had validated those designs in vivo. But the material challenge nobody was ever able to solve. So when we put out this paper, me and my co-founder, Dr. Arjun Ramakrishnan, we realized that if we could solve this problem of polyimide synthesis, we could essentially allow a lot of users, a lot of technology creators to now make neural interfaces with their designs for their target applications. So the whole motivation behind it was, let's demonstrate the synthesis of a clinical grade polyimide that somebody can make in their lab or somebody can make in a clean setting, allow for its characterization, explain how this material can be characterized and validated for its, let's say, moisture absorption, for its electrical properties, for its mechanical properties, for its thermal properties. And how do you maximize what kind of processing can you do that maximizes its efficacy as a neural substrate and an insulator? So that was, one part of the paper. From there, we developed recipes for our own polyimide material that could allow us to make neural interfaces using photolithography and clean room processing. And we developed two kinds of designs. We developed an ECOG, which is a surface array, and a depth electrode that goes inside the brain. And we demonstrated with in vivo recordings that with both of these, you could actually capture signals, you could capture interesting data, and you could analyze it and translate it so that it's useful for either the brain-computer interfacing technology or even medical devices if needed. So the whole objective of the paper was, or the preprint right now, is to allow users who've manufactured flexible interfaces and who see the potential of it to now commercially translate it and start making their medical devices. There's nothing that potentially stops them from doing so.
That's really cool that you guys are taking advantage of this gap.
Thank you.
And so to go back and ask another quick question about like the early days of your startup. I know you have some experience, in academia at Carnegie Mellon, and then you have experience at, multiple fast-paced neurotech startups, working there as an employee, and you kind of already gave us a little bit of an overview on what inspired you to start your own startup, and also like a little bit of the competitive advantage that you found yourself having, and so I wanted to do another quick follow-up question on that and just ask, how are the differences between, working at a startup versus starting your own, and how was that transition between switching between, those two types of roles? And do you have any tips for listeners of the podcast who might be looking to make the same transition in the future?
Certainly, that's a good question. So, if we go to business, if we try to understand business essentials, right? What differentiates a regular, business from a startup? A startup is something that develops a technology disruptor. So it's a radical new technology that has the potential to disrupt the status quo of what's currently out there. So working at a startup, you're kind of working day and night with limited funds to accelerate your vision and try to develop something that shows the potential of the disruptive technology that you have. Now, because of that, and because of the limited resources that you have at a startup, it's all hands on deck essentially. So everybody has to do everything. You have to be working around the clock to kind of validate your vision. And it's also you've got to break the problem in several steps where each milestone that you hit has to be presented, get guidance on basically how you can push this forward. So, several such milestones can eventually help you realize, all right, this is the technology we have, and this is how it's going to disrupt the existing technologies out there. Now, on the other side, when you look at a business does not create, a traditional business, let me put that, is something that adds value to the existing value chain, right? So when you have, let's say, let's take the example of McDonald's. Somebody is supplying them the buns, somebody is supplying them with the lettuce. And there's a whole value chain that goes into creating this business, right? That McDonald's does, which is to provide sandwiches and milkshakes, right? So the whole idea of a business is to be a part of the value chain and be able to capture some of the value that's in that value chain. So when I started my company, I kind of focused on running it as a business as opposed to a startup, because the technology innovation that I'm doing is not it's not a disruptor in the right scheme of things. So because such interfaces have been made in the past and have been validated. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture value by being one of the suppliers to larger medical device firms that can then leverage my technology and then use them in their neural interfaces. So the whole idea of when I moved from a startup and decided to start my own company, I realized I had to do two things. I had to create and capture value. Okay, so my niche is polyimide. I'm going to synthesize polyimide. I'm going to start supplying it. I'm going to make interfaces with it, and I'm going to supply them. And the second is to have a competitive advantage. It's what distinguishes me from somebody else. If let's say someone in Europe decides to synthesize polyimide as well, what distinguishes them from me? So I realized that these two things are something that I needed to have in order to create a business that's sustainable. Because of, working in this field, there's a lot of goodwill that you accumulate. You know people, you've attended conferences, and the quality of work is attested for, right? Because you've networked and worked with so many people. So when I started, I kind of had a goal in mind. Okay, these are the companies that I want to supply to. This is what my business model is. This is how I'm going to capture value. This is my innovation and my competitive advantage is that I'm the only one able to make polyimide, the clinical polyimide at a reasonable price, right? So that it makes it affordable to create neural interfaces that can be, that have the potential to be sold and be affordable. So those are the two, I would say, big differences. When you're at a startup, you go all in for that vision, for that idea. When you're running a business, you're always working on capturing value and then having or establish or sustaining a competitive advantage.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thanks for explaining frameworks behind, the various companies you were previously working for and then the company that you're building now. And so that brings me into my next question. Yuqing and I are a little bit more familiar with like the startup landscape in the US and in Europe a little bit as well. But I was wondering if, since you're starting to build within the neurotech ecosystem in India, if you can kind of share with us like what the neurotech ecosystem in India looks like and kind of what you envision the neurotech ecosystem in India looking like for the next few years.
Certainly. I think, because this is such a collaborative project where you need people of different skills and from different areas and different expertise, you kind of tend to work with a lot of people across the globe. So it kind of makes this challenge a universal challenge as opposed to, different geographies or different demographics having a certain knowledge over the others. Because, even though I'm making my devices in India, a lot of my customers are still in the US or in Europe. So the question is, how does Asia fit into this landscape, right? And traditionally, because of the cost of translation and then because of labor being more affordable, Asia has always been a manufacturing hub for a lot of products, right? I mean, these days, anything you go to the supermarket, anything you purchase at a supermarket, there's a good chance it's made in China or in India or, another South Asian country. And that's because the economics work out. Whereas labor is cheaper, resources, the raw materials are cheaper in Asia because that's where the mined are found. And that gives them a little leverage. But the end use, right, and a lot of the research, the actual data, right, that's coming out is still from the West. But that landscape is changing a little bit, especially post-COVID. While India typically, manufactured chemicals, manufactured vaccines, it didn't really have a lot of original biology research, electrophysiology research that happened here. And even in China, I think and I wouldn't say it's because of the lack of expertise or anything, but it's just because the economics of that country worked out in that way, right? That you're kind of focusing on other ways to create value. But post COVID, the landscape has changed quite a bit, and I think because in like in my previous answer, I said this is kind of the next evolution of mankind. a lot of governments have been focusing on it as well. So there's a lot of government impetus to focus on electrophysiology, collect data, make brain-computer interfaces, kind of accentuate human capabilities. I know it sounds a little far-fetched now, but maybe 20 years later it could become a reality. So I know China's been doing this a lot. They've got their own startups manufacturing their own BCIs and collecting data. But even India, which is traditionally, the global hub for vaccines, right? A lot of the vaccines and drugs are manufactured here. It kind of segued into animal research. So you have a lot of animal research that's picking up, and it's growing. This is just a number at the top of my head, but around every year, you're seeing at least a 20 to 30% increase in the number of people doing electrophysiology research. And much like the Human Genome Project, right, where the whole world was involved in mapping the genomic sequence, there's something similar to that, to it called the Human Connectome Project, where everybody's trying to record and piece together or map different parts of the brain, and that collective information can then be used for the betterment of humanity. And I think India as a country is just starting off there, but the rate at which these experiments are picking up is tremendous. But having said that, because of the collaborative nature of this challenge, I think there's still a lot of interdependence between the countries, between geographies and demographics. And I do see, it being more collaborative than competitive, in the coming future. As of today, and from how what I see as a market in India, I think it's definitely growing, and there's still more exciting research that's coming out.
Yeah, sounds like it's an exciting time, and exciting years ahead as well. And yeah, definitely happy to hear about those collaborations and also, the electrophysiology research kind of picking up as well.
Yeah, indeed.
I will ask a quick question in terms of, we spoke a little bit about the future, and I was wondering for Eywa specifically, you mentioned that you're starting to put out some papers, doing verification. What do you envision happening for the company for the next year to 5 years? Like, what will you tackle the same problem through like different ways, or do you want to tackle different problems as well?
No, I think so. That's a good question. I think right now we're focusing on targeting epilepsy, developing treatments for epilepsy. Just the sheer, the in the treatment of epilepsy, right? I guess about 10 or 20% of people still have drug-resistant epilepsy, and they can really benefit from surgeries that happen with these implantable electrodes, right? In which there's a surgery called SEEG, stereo EEG, where surgeons put in these electrodes. They're able to record and isolate the seizure onset zone, and they're able to either resect it or ablate it. And it's really efficient, and it's a pretty safe treatment for curing drug-resistant epilepsy. And there's a huge market for it in India as well. So while the way this business we're running the business is, we're trying to create a cash flow, a revenue flow through the sale of our Polyimide, through the sale of our neural interfaces within the animal markets. But the long-term vision is to start using some of the technology we've developed for the creation of SEEG electrodes and for the treatment of epilepsy in general. So while the acute market, when I say acute, I mean the animal electrophysiology market is steady now, and it's giving us a regular cash flow. It's our vision is ultimately to get into humans and to really apply the technology for that. And epilepsy is the first target that we're envisioning. And even in India today, I believe there are close to 1.5 million people who need such a surgery. So being able to develop a product for them can really help me and the company add value, and even help humanity in general. So that's the goal.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool. And I'm excited to see the developments. And I would honestly, Eywa can provide some treatments and solutions for those conditions. That would be very, very helpful, like you said. All right. I think last question for like a kind of a technical perspective, tying back together, coming from like this MEMS and materials background, Do you think the neurotech space would benefit from adding more experts from like a specific field or background? It could be your own, it could be some other field. And like, if so, why?
That's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer as well, because it's hard to give weightage to everyone's contributions to this project. But I think it's the way I think of it is thin films are have a significant competitive advantage to the traditional treatment options that are available today. But it's not foolproof. It's not at a place where I can say, all right, this is going to be the next big thing. It's not the next Apple iPhone, right? Versus the traditional Java phones that we used to use in the past. I can't say that thin films are the answer. And I know it's counterintuitive for me to say that because I'm running a business in that field. But there's always a new technology that comes in and basically makes a previous technology redundant. Now the thing is, because of the patterning and the design capabilities of MEMS and thin films, it makes it very lucrative because in a tiny area you could pack more electrodes, you have better spatial resolution, and less surgical trauma, and all these good advantages to it. But at the same time, it's not an interface that lasts in vivo forever. There's so much research that's happened, but with, with with the exception of maybe the BlackRock Utah area, there's still an interface that's to be seen that could last in a human for 5 years and function correctly. Well, I see these two sides to the argument that thin films have an advantage, but thin films also may not be the answer. I think the way the industry could benefit is by adding more material scientists, and also I would think more neurophysiologists, because it's the time it takes to iterate, right, is quite long right now. When you create an interface,
Mhm.
it takes weeks to create an interface. It takes months to get feedback on it because somebody has to do the surgeries, has to analyze the data, and we still don't know whether we're doing the right thing or we're not, because it's anybody's take, right? There isn't this. There's no definitive way of saying, all right, this is what works or this is what doesn't. I mean, I'm pretty sure, and don't get me wrong, but there are certain researchers who've claimed that their technology does, let's say, lasts in vivo for 2 years. And if the same technology is used or created by somebody else, it doesn't, because there's a huge variation in the biological aspects of it. So having, a lot of neurophysiologists in this field, along with material scientists, would definitely you know, definitely allow thin films to become a better solution. I think, from an electrical engineering perspective, we've got the patterning and the processing of it, down to the wire. I don't think anything would change in that. We've demonstrated that we could do, features down to 100 nanometers, and that's great, right? It doesn't make sense to go, smaller than that, but at that point, that's great technology. So nothing changes on that front. But it's the biology and it's the materials that that have to be worked on, in my opinion,
Mhm.
to really make this a reality.
Yeah, and certainly the many, many different specialists all must collaborate together to make this entire package work. And that's why I'm glad like people like you and your company are kind of making sure that every step of the way is as smooth as possible so we can really speed up this iteration loop. And ultimately, like you said, we won't know until we put them in humans for a few years.
Right.
I really look forward to that happening in the next decade or so.
Yep. Yep.
And so, kind of keeping with the theme of this being a very interdisciplinary field, I was wondering if you had any tips for students, from various levels of education and from various different fields on how they can break into the biotech or the neurotech industry.
Yeah, that's a good question. Even in academia, I kind of recommend this approach. The best thing to do is to pick up a review paper. So there are lots of review papers on different neurotechnologies that are out there that kind of sum up all the happenings in the field. History, I feel, always gives you that perspective that's needed, to decide whether you want to work in this field, whether you have the ability to add value to this field, or even learn from, or be helping hands, in this field. So the first thing I would do is the moment you've got interest in a certain topic, it's always good to read review papers, even before you read textbooks, because textbooks give you the theoretical knowledge. They're able to tell you, okay, this is how it works, this is the theory behind it. But it's always the review papers that kind of catch you up on what the happenings are, the latest happenings are, what the shortcomings of this technology are, what the advantages are, and what are some new approaches that are being taken. And the other thing I would say is for new students who are getting into the field, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the field. So if somebody's done, a project, right, and they've seen, all right, it's got so and so limitations, and they work well in some applications, but not all. It doesn't make sense for students to kind of reinvent that and try that again with the hope of getting more success. I think it's always better to learn from mistakes that others have made, and then try to gain or try to engineer a solution that's different and that really kind of adds a delta over what's currently out there. And sometimes, when you go through papers, right, you kind of see that the nature of science is cyclical, because what's done in the 80s kind of resurfaces 20 years later, and then it gets validated, it gets tested out, and then 10 years later it's something from the 90s that gets picked up and tried out, right? Like, for instance, there's so many technologies, like even this technology, for instance. It's a lot of people think it's new, but it's not. It was tested in the 80s, and then people did not want to work with it at all because nobody wanted to work with silicon. It's fragile, it's brittle. Whenever you try to work with those, they break quite a lot of the times. So the first person to make this was Dr. Ken Weiss. He was an electrical engineer as well, and he kind of picked this technology and thought, okay, let's use it for this application. And then for the next 5 years, nothing happened. Nobody adopted it, nobody accepted it, until somebody picked it up again. And it didn't commercialize until 20 years later. It's for new students, I would say, history of the technology that you're planning on getting into is always the best way to understand the landscape, and then be able to assess whether your skills or the skills you want to acquire would be better suited for it or not. And another thing I would say is, okay, this might be a little tricky because it's not in the favor of academia, but I want to be honest about it, is not every research can be commercialized. A lot of papers that come out, this incremental delta, right, that's available in different research papers and the research of different professors, but it's not always commercial. Again, when you kind of get into a research area, always make sure that there are opportunities you can tap into, be it through business, through work, through employment, or through collaborations that you could do after you graduate. Because you don't want to be in a situation where you worked for so many years in a field only to realize that there's no financial gains that can be derived from it. Kind of approach it holistically, understand what interests you, what excites you, read the review papers, understand the history of it, and just try to assess how you can add value to it, and also look at what the potential financial and creative outcomes you can get. And at the end of the day, I think studies are kind of like an investment, right? You're kind of investing time and money into acquiring skills, and if they don't pay off, then it's tricky, right? It's unfortunate. So just use that holistic approach to enter a problem, enter an area, and go on with it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice and really well-rounded advice as well. Especially that part that you mentioned about looking at review papers really resonated with me. I totally agree with your statement there about how really diving into the review papers is a good way to quickly get yourself caught up with kind of what's going on lately in the field. The part you mentioned about looking at your education as an investment, it also resonated with me as well. It's you're kind of investing in yourself, and that's a really strategic way to look at things. And so we've been talking a little bit about history here, but I wanted to next talk a little bit about the future. And so I was wondering if you have any predictions for the field of neurotechnology over the next 20 years. And we've touched on this a little bit in the episode already, but I was wondering if you could first speak on, in a zoomed in sense, your predictions for the specific subset of the field of the neurotechnology field that you're working within, and then also zoom out a little further and let us know if you have any predictions for neurotechnology at large, and maybe even from an impact on society standpoint.
Certainly, certainly. I think I'd like to answer this in two parts. One as the short-term future and one as the long-term future. In the short-term future, I definitely think that neurotechnology will make a huge impact in medicine, so in surgical medicine, because while most neurotechnology startups are focused on the central nervous system, there's so much potential of the peripheral nervous system as well. Because a couple of days ago, I was reading a news article from Australia where they're trying to use electricity and stimulation to control appetite, irritable bowel syndrome, and Crohn's disease. So they're using electricity to network with the vagus nerve that goes to the abdomen and tries to regulate or alleviate some of the conditions, right? Abdominal conditions that patients face. Similarly, some very low-hanging fruits in this industry are urinary incontinence or the spinal cord stimulation. And it kind of makes you realize that there's so many things that electricity and stimulation, right? Functional electrical stimulation can do that you could really find, a niche, create a device for that, and it could really help people. Both, from a creative perspective, a social perspective, and an economic perspective. So for me, the short-term future is all about medicine, in medical devices. It's not about PCIs just yet. As far as the long-term future goes, I definitely think that the more research we do, and this may not happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but I anticipate that eventually we'll find some balance between physics and biology that allows us to create a neural interface that could last in vivo for at least 5 years. Now, I know there are some like the BlackRock Utah array, but from an efficacy point of view, right, from the ability to pick up information, translate it, and use it practically, I think in general the field would have reached there in the next 10 years or so. So my predictions are that another 10, 15 years, I think invasive BCIs would take off big time. And even further ahead into that future, I do see a lot of potential for not just treatments, but even biohacking, where somebody could add different modalities to their physical body with the use of these neural interfaces. But there's still questions around ethics. There's still questions around technology. The jury's still out on that, but I think that's where we're headed towards. That we're going to have medical devices in the near future in neurotechnology, and then we're going to have a lot of work on PCIs and biohacking in the later future. But the impact that neurotechnology will have, both invasive as well as non-invasive, is going to be tremendous. I think we weren't from an evolutionary point of view, the brain is really the only organ that we haven't completely understood. We kind of know what the kidneys do, what the stomach does, what the colon does, but we don't really understand the brain, and that's really the last magical element in history that we're yet to figure out. And the moment we do, I think it has immense implications. It's going to be fantastic. So yeah, I'm excited, and I see a lot of enthusiastic people, and I think they can contribute towards this goal and create an environment that gets more people excited about and more effort gets poured into neurotechnology.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited about this space as well. And the thing you mentioned about the brain being one of the main things about our body that we haven't really truly figured out yet, that's one of the things that kind of drew me to become interested in this field. Yeah, definitely exciting times ahead in the neurotech space. We're seeing innovation across materials, AI, biology, and I think those innovations will all start to mesh together. And I think it definitely leaves a bright future ahead for the space.
Indeed, indeed. And I'm glad you and Yuqing are doing this because when there's more outreach, the more eyeballs that fall into this product, and the more people get excited, and there's more innovation that happens. And there's always like incremental steps, right? Incremental delta, like I call it, that pushes a field forward. It's never an overnight success. It's always smaller increments that get it there. But I'm excited, and I'm glad you guys are excited, and I hope the listeners are excited as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely trying to build community in this space, and the more people that join the field, the better.
Indeed, indeed.
And so I don't think we had any additional questions for you today, but we wanted to end off by asking, should our listeners contact you for further discussion after the episode? And if so, who should reach out to you, and how can they reach out to you? And what types of topics would you be open to being reached out to about?
Absolutely. I love it when people talk to me about this field, the technology involved in this field. I think anybody who's interested in either MEMS and flexible interfaces or even BCIs in general should, can reach out to me. My email ID is on my LinkedIn profile, and it's also on our webpage on Eywa Neuro. So, I encourage people to hit me up, and I always love a good discussion on these things. And if I can help out anybody in any way, or even get them interested in a technology, it makes my days. As for the listeners, undergrads, postgrads, people excited about MEMS, people who don't know science but still want to learn more about it, they're welcome to hit me up and speak to me.